The next section that we're covering is section 4.8. I'm actually going a little out of order. So the last section we did was section 4.6. I'm going to jump ahead 2 sections to 4.8, and then we're going to go back and when we're together in class do 4.7. So 4.8, I'm going to split up into 3 short videos instead of doing 1 long video. 4.8 is focused on what happens when you have to take the square root of a negative number. So for example, if you look at the very first question on here, it says, what happens when x squared equals negative 1? So we know from previous lessons that we're going to square root both sides. So the question is, how do we do that? And from the time you learn what square root is, I think the first teacher that probably explained it to you would have said, well, you can't take the square root of a negative number. If you try to do it in the calculator, you're going to get an error. Well, in Algebra 2, we actually can with a slight adjustment and tweaking. I will be honest, this is not my favorite section in Algebra 2. However, I know that this does show up on ACTs and on like college placement tests, and it's not a difficult topic at all. So I want to make sure you're comfortable with it so that when you see it, you don't get scared by it, don't get confused by it, and you realize that the problems are not very much extra work. So here's how we deal with it. We look at something called the imaginary unit. Imaginary unit is going to be represented by the letter I. And essentially, it's going to be like our workaround for how are we going to deal with the square root of a negative number. We're going to use this lowercase I, and the I stands for imaginary. And essentially, that I is going to be the equivalent of taking the square root of a negative 1. So it's going to be that I adjustment. So the biggest thing I want to show you is how do you write this? How does this actually work when you write it out? We are not going to use a calculator in this first video. The second and the third video, I am going to show you some calculator buttons that also make things a little easier. So if you look down at the bottom when it says the square root of a negative number, if r is a positive real number and we take the square root of it, then essentially all we're doing is we're putting this I in front to basically denote that it was started out as a negative value underneath. So for example, if I asked you what the square root of negative 5 was, you would put an I out front, which indicates that it was negative, and then leave the 5 under the square root. So your answer would be read as I root 5. Same thing with the square root of 13. You'd bring the I out to indicate that it was negative, meaning that it results in an imaginary number, and then you'd leave the 13 underneath. If the number under the radical is not only negative, but it also happens to be a perfect square, so like the square root of negative 25, well, we know the square root of 25 is 5, but then we put an I there, again, to indicate that it started out as a negative value under the radical. If the number is not a perfect square, like 24 is not a perfect square, but it has a perfect square factor, we're going to break it down like we did in class. 24 is not a perfect square, but let's see what goes into it. 4 is a perfect square that goes into it. So you're still going to use that list that we talked about in class. The square root of 4 is 2. You are still going to include an I because of the negative in there. And then the 6 is going to be left under the radical. So your answer would be 2I root 6. The 2 comes from square rooting the 4. The I comes from the fact that it was negative, and the 6 is left underneath the radical. So we're going to use this to help us solve equations that involve square roots. So if you look at all this whole slide, all of these problems have something being squared, an x squared, and the goal was to solve it. It's going to use a lot of the same skills that we did in class yesterday, but we are going to have a lot of negatives when we take the square root. So the first one, actually the whole first row is really fast. You take the square root of both sides. When you do that, a couple things that you have to realize. First of all, when you square root both sides, you get a plus or minus. Second thing you should realize is you are square rooting a number that is negative, so you need to include an I. And the last thing is I can't do anything with a 3. It's not a perfect square. It doesn't have any perfect square factors. So my solutions would be plus or minus I root 3. Same thing for the next one. When I square root both sides, I'm going to get a plus or minus. I'm going to get an I because of the negative, and I'm going to keep the 7 under the radical because it has no perfect square factors. The next one has one extra step. We still start with square rooting. 20 can be broken down. It can be broken down into 4 times 5 because 4 is a perfect square factor of 20. So when we write our answer, it's going to be plus or minus. The square root of 4 is 2. We include an I because it is a negative under a radical, and then we still have the 5 that is left under the square root sign. The bottom row has a little extra work. First, you have to isolate. So anytime you have the x squared that has extra stuff with it, make sure you isolate the x squared first. So I'm going to divide by 7 to get that x squared by itself. Then I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. And just like one of the ones that we did earlier, we're going to have a plus or minus. We're going to have an I because of the negative under the radical. And we're going to have a square root of 7 because 7 has no perfect factors. Next one's going to take a couple steps. We've got to add 5, to get the minus 5 to the other side. So we have 3x squared equals negative 27. Then we're going to divide by 3. So we get x squared equals negative 9. I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. First, you're going to notice that we have to have a plus or minus. The next thing is 9 is already perfect. We do not have to break it down. We don't need to make a factor tree. The square root of 9 is just 3, but we are going to include an I with our answer because it was a negative 9, not a positive 9. So my solutions are plus or minus 3i. Next one, I'm going to subtract 5 to start the process of isolating the x squared. That's going to give me a 24. To get rid of the negative 1/2 coefficient, you're going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal, which is negative 2. So multiply by negative 2. So you get negative 48. Now I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. So I get plus or minus. I'm going to break down 48. So 48 has a few factors that are perfect, but the biggest one is 16. So it is 16 times 3. You might have thought of 4 times 12. However, we can go bigger. 16 is a perfect square that goes into 48. So we get plus or minus 4i. The 4 comes from the square root of 16, and the I comes from the negative, and then root 3. 3 more problems, and then we're done with this first part of 4.8. So again, start by isolating. So subtract 3. We get x squared equals negative 5. Excuse me. Take the square root of both sides to get rid of the squared. We get plus or minus I because of the negative, and 5 cannot be broken down at all. 5 is not a perfect square. It has no perfect square factors. So we're going to leave our answer like that. Next one, we're going to add 4 to both sides. It does not matter that it's y squared instead of x squared. You're still going to do the same thing no matter what the variable is. Square root both sides to get rid of the squared. So we have y equals plus or minus. 8 is not a perfect square, but it can be broken down into 4 times 2. The square root of 4 is 2. We have to include an I because of the negative and with the 8, and then we still have a root 2. So plus or minus 2i root 2. Last one is a little longer. This might be one that you want to kind of jot down just because it has a few extra steps. So we're going to subtract 15 to start the isolating process. So we have 2x minus 1 squared equals negative 12 when I do 3 minus 15. Then I have to divide. Remember, I cannot distribute because that parentheses is being squared. So I have x minus 1 squared equals negative 6. Square root both sides. On the left side, you're going to be left with x minus 1. On the right, I can't do anything with the 6. It's not perfect square. It has no perfect square factors, but I can bring an I out front. So I'm going to have plus or minus I root 6. And this one does have an extra step at the end because the goal is to solve for x, so you need to add 1 to both sides. So my solutions are plus or minus I root 6 plus 1. So those are all of the ways that we solve with square roots when we have a negative under the radical. A lot of these problems you won't really know if you're going to have a negative under the radical until you take a few steps. So you won't know if there's an I or a not in your answer until you're ready to take the square root. And that's the first part of 4.8.